Hello, 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 hello. There are still a number of seats down in front. This event was sold out, but not oversold. So if you'd like to be on the next flight, we can't help you. But I just want to make sure everybody has seats. If there's a seat near you, would you raise your hand, stand, and just sing a song if you don't mind? Just, all right. All right, well, why don't we, there's seats here. All right, well, I'm going to leave it to you. But let me then officially say, welcome to Socrates in the City. Thank you for coming. As you can see, are you George Gilder? Yeah. We've been expecting you. How are you, George? Now, you know you're not speaking this evening, but you're going to be speaking soon, very soon. There's a seat here for you, if you don't mind. Nobody's looking at you. Don't worry. That's the George Gilder. Yeah. Okay, well, as I hope you know, I am thrilled about this evening for many reasons, not least because we are sold out. I do have to say that, to be sold out is always a good thing. And I don't mean that you're, sellouts. I mean that you understand what I mean. It's not like when Billy Joel did Uptown Girl kind of sellout, right? It's a good kind of sellout. Thank you, Greg. All right, so I guess that's just a warning that if you're registering for Socrates, we actually do sell out. We're not kidding. Well, if you cannot come to Socrates in the City, as you can see by the thousands of cameras, we're doing our best to film all of these in HD and put them on the web as soon as we can get them edited. Are the editors in the room? No pressure. But as soon as we get them edited, we get them on the web, and we want to get these wonderful conversations out to as wide an audience as possible. Speaking of who is in the room, actually, George Gilder just announced himself, and we have my friend Jay Richards is here also. These are, in my mind, future Socrates in the City speakers. I hope that they can afford... to accept our extraordinarily low honorarium. But in any case, but I have to say, speaking of who is in the room, we have one of the most brilliant authors of recent decades. I know you're all thinking I'm talking about myself. I'm not. I wouldn't put myself in that category publicly. I'm not gonna say who it is, of course, but I will give you his initials. I can say his initials. They're Tom Wolfe. Do you know Tom Wolfe? The man in the white suit seated right here. I hope, When you become an icon, people will embarrass you. There's just nothing you can do about it. It's tough. When I heard that Tom Wolfe was going to be here, I got nervous. I immediately ran out and bought a bespoke suit for the evening. And it was very expensive, but obviously I'm going to return it tomorrow. Honestly, before I talk about Stephen Meyer, who is our very special guest for the evening, I just had to say one more thing about Tom Wolfe. And I just said this to him, and he doesn't mind. I hope. He pretended not to mind. But... he wrote a book. He's written many books, obviously, many huge books. The Right Stuff, Bonfire of the Vanities, Don't Applaud. He's very shy. But there's a teensy-weensy book that he wrote called The Painted Word, which I had the great joy of reading a number of years ago. And it's less than 100 pages. It is, like most of his stuff, just ridiculously entertaining. But what it does is it kills, dissects the world of modern art so spectacularly brilliantly that there's really nothing more to be said ever on that subject. When I found out that he was going to be here, I found 9 copies of the book so that those of you who sprint to the book table can get that, and maybe he'll sign it for you. But if you can't get one of those 9 copies, honestly, it is just ridiculously wonderful, and it's also, I would say, definitive, as I think I said a moment ago, in what it says. It's just, you'll read it, you'll know what I mean. You'll never go to MoMA again. Yes, I'm looking at you. And it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So thank you for allowing me to embarrass you, sir. All right, you can open your eyes now. It's over. I want to, and before I talk about Steve, I want to thank the Discovery Institute and especially the McClellan Foundation for making this evening possible. As I've said over and over again, it's not easy for us to do these events. They're expensive. A number of you have been generous with us over the years, and this time I do want to acknowledge the folks at McClellan and Charlie Phillips for just making this possible. So thank you so much. Well, and now to the man of the hour, the man of the week, Mr. Rich Little. No, I almost said Mr. Stephen Meyer. I have trouble with the Mr. and Doctor. The other day, this is not a joke, I meant to say Doctor Who, and I said Mr. Who. It's the less successful brother of Doctor Who. I looked it up on the internet. But no, tonight our special guest, very special guest, is Dr. Stephen Meyer. If you didn't know, he is one of the founders of the so-called intelligent design movement. So we know that he's terribly brilliant, but you may also know that he's terribly brave because the ID movement has, by its very existence, threatened many of the most beloved tenets of the powerful scientific establishment. And those in that powerfully entrenched establishment have taken every opportunity to try and strangle this baby in the cradle, so to speak, but they have not succeeded. Indeed, the baby in the cradle managed to get out of the cradle and first crawled, then walked, and is now in fact running hither and yon, merrily spreading havoc and fear amongst ideologically calcified materialists everywhere. And of course, we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. But what exactly is the ID movement? Well, I'll ask Stephen Meyer in just a moment. In the meantime, let me tell you about him. He graduated from Whitworth College in Spokane. Is that said? Spokane, Washington? Did I get that right? Thank you. With a degree in physics and earth science, and worked for an oil company as a geophysicist. His bio says he worked in seismic survey interpretation, but at one time or another, haven't we all done that? I would say most of us in the room have worked in that at one time or another. Not a big deal. But then he got a huge scholarship to get a PhD at Cambridge University in the history and philosophy of science. And this is no joke. That extraordinary and life-changing scholarship was awarded to him by the Rotary Club. That is true, right? I'm not just playing that for laughs. No, not the Shriners. I heard somebody say that. The Shriners, of course, typically send their people to Oxford. That's just, it's their tradition. Yeah. So Dr. Meyer's thesis at Cambridge offered a methodological interpretation of origin of life research. And, well, of course, after that, he was off to the races. Here we are. He founded the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture in 2002 and is now, among other things, their director. Some of you know Dr. Meyer's previous book, Signature in the Cell, abbreviated SITC, and I will sue you. Oh, I will. Yeah. The thing in the New Testament about not suing the brethren, I'm a dispensationalist. That ended when John died, I think. And so I'm free to sue you, and I will sue you. In any case, in the book Signature in the Cell, he examined the mystery of the origin of life. That book was named one of the top books of 2009 by the Times Literary Supplement of London, which I would say is about as staggering a mainstream endorsement as one is likely to come by. It's almost as if Danny DeVito or Cher had praised the book. It's that big. It's that mainstream. Of course, other brave souls in academia and elsewhere gave it tremendously good reviews, and of course was very controversial. Dr. Thomas Nagel, professor at NYU, praised it effusively and called it a careful presentation of a fiendishly difficult problem. For his honesty, Dr. Nagel was widely excoriated by the scientific establishment, and I think since Dr. Nagel is at NYU, we ought to invite him to speak at Socrates in the city. I think we'll enjoy that, so perhaps somebody can give me his information. But very brave to do for an NYU professor, I think. Dr. Meyer's latest book, and the one we'll focus on this evening, is, of course, titled Darwin's Doubt, which has already been a New York Times bestseller. And again, brave souls in the academic world have stepped up to offer it high praise. Dr. Mark Meneman, paleontologist at Mount Holyoke, writes, "It's hard for us paleontologists to admit that neo-Darwinian explanations for the Cambrian explosion have failed miserably." Meyer describes the dimensions of the problem with clarity and precision. His book is a game changer. Dr. George Church, professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, writes, is that a typo? Harvard Medical School, really? What's he doing now? He wrote that Darwin's doubt represents an opportunity for bridge building rather than dismissive polarization, bridges across cultural divides in great need of professional, respectful dialogue, and bridges to span evolutionary gaps. And I might add, yeah, sure. Okay, so for our format tonight, I will interview Dr. Meyer for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. That's where you come in. I hope we'll have microphones set up here. Before I bring him up, I should say that in 2008, Dr. Meyer famously appeared with Ben Stein in the documentary Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. Some of you may know that, know him from that. He's also been widely featured on innumerable TV programs all over the spectrum, and you may have seen his most recent appearance on The Sweet Life of Zach and Cody. How about a warm Socrates in the City welcome for Dr. Stephen Meyer? Man, ridiculous. In your words, and it's kind of funny to ask the founder of something, what does intelligent design, the movement, mean?
Well, the theory of intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by a purposive intelligence rather than an undirected material process, such as in the realm of biology, natural selection acting on random mutations. Now, that's a mouthful. It's a kind of a definition, but I can unpack that a little bit. And one way to do that is to contrast intelligent design with that specific meaning of evolution that the theory was designed to challenge.
Okay.
There are three meanings of evolution, three basic meanings. One is change over time. And that can refer to the fact that life is different now than it was a long time ago. We do not have the T-Rex running down Fifth Avenue. We don't have trilobites out in the Atlantic Ocean. Things are different now than they used to be. That change over time concept can also refer to the observable, modest changes that we see taking place in the structure of organisms. The famous Galapagos finches. When the weather patterns changed in the Galapagos a while back, it's documented that the birds with slightly longer beaks did better than the ones with shorter beaks, so you got a cyclical variation in the shape and size of beaks. So that's also an idea of change over time, or evolution in that sense. And the meaning, the idea of change over time is not really contentious or disputed. The second meaning of evolution is the idea.
It would be disputed
by almost
among
anyone.
Young Earth creationists.
Well, possibly. You know,
all right, they're not allowed into this club anymore.
Well, there would be.
But
a question of how long the time scale is involved in the change that has occurred.
But the basic idea, just so everybody's tracking, the basic idea of change over time, that life forms have changed over the millennia, eons, is not generally disputed.
Not generally disputed.
And that intelligent design...
We're certainly not disputing evolution.
And every kind of evolution
right.
would say that happened.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Second meaning of evolution is the idea of common ancestry. And that can refer to universal common ancestry, the idea that all organisms are connected by what Darwin called descent from modification, from one single simple form, simple primordial form way back when. Or it could be a more limited thesis that certain groups of organisms are related by common ancestry. But the Darwinian idea was that the history of life is best represented as a kind of tree of life. And he actually drew a tree in The Origin to depict this, where the branches at the top of the tree represent all the forms of life that exist today. The trunk or the root of that tree represents that first primordial form, and the ones that only made it halfway up are the ones that got extinct. So it's a visual depiction of his idea about the history of life. And intelligent design is not challenging that either, although there are advocates of intelligent design who are skeptical about that.
Right.
And in fact, there are other scientists who are not
So
pro-ID.
you'd consider even common descent to be a theory, not necessarily
It's definitely
true.
a theory.
It's a theory.
It's an attempt to
Okay.
interpret certain facts that we have left behind, and certainly no one saw that whole history.
Right.
So it's a reconstruction
Right.
based on the facts that are left behind, and it's one of many possible reconstructions. But it's not what intelligent design is challenging either. The intelligent design is challenging the third meaning of evolution, and that's the idea that there is an unguided, undirected process known as natural selection acting on random mutations that has produced all the forms of life we see, but also has produced the appearance of design that all biologists acknowledge, or nearly all biologists acknowledge. Richard Dawkins, the world's foremost spokesman for so-called neo-Darwinism, the modern textbook version of Darwin's theory, says that life is, that biology, rather, is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose.
How clever of them.
It is the counterintuitive nature of the Darwinian idea.
Right.
That things look, yes, they look designed, whether
Right.
it's that beautiful structure of the coiled nautilus or those intricate molecular machines or the chambered structure of the heart with
Right.
all its plumbing and wiring. Many, many things in biology look as though they were designed, but the idea is that they were produced by an undirected, unguided process that produced the appearance of design.
Right.
So they would say natural selection has the power to mimic natural selection mimics the powers of a designing intelligence, but it is not designed or guided in any way. Thus, the leading proponents of Darwinism will say that we have design without a designer. We have the appearance of design without a designer.
Is that what it's called, blind Darwinism?
Well, sometimes it's called the blind watchmaker hypothesis,
Okay.
after the title of one of Dawkins' famous books.
Okay.
And so intelligent design is challenging that, and the title, or the term intelligent design was selected intelligently, if you will, to make clear which of those three meanings of evolution we're challenging explicitly. We think that there are certain features of biological systems that were actually designed, and you can tell by examining the scientific evidence.
Okay, so just so that everyone's tracking with you and so that I'm tracking with you, I'm going to repeat back to you what you just said.
Sure.
But not tonight.
Not
Excuse me. Because I think that in the popular culture, these distinctions are never clearly made. You would get the idea that there are two theories. One theory is that we were created 11,000 years ago, and Shazam, here we are. The other theory is the scientific theory that says everything happened by random forces, and that we evolved out of primordial soup, and here we are, and there is absolutely no God involved in that process. But what you're saying now, and obviously what I've read about, is that there are so many variations between those two poles. And so intelligent design, as I understand it, says that, yes, this happened. There were trilobites 4 billion years ago, and things have, quote-unquote, evolved. Things have changed. Maybe I don't want to use the word evolved because it's a little bit loaded, but things have, in fact, changed. We can see this. We can observe this in the fossil record, basically. But blind Darwinists, neo-Darwinists, would say there is no way that could have been directed. There was no God involved in that process. They say that adamantly.
No designer or intelligent agent of any kind.
No agent. It
Right.
was just utterly random, and it was something that...
Eric, I prefer the term undirected or
Undirected.
mindless. Okay, because
And why?
Well, because you could have something that's random, that appears to be random to us, that actually has a hidden hand behind it. And the Darwinians insist that the appearance of design is an illusion. Now,
Right.
if it's an illusion, it follows logically that the process that produced the appearance of design was not mindful. It was unguided and undirected.
Right.
And so that's the crucial tenet. And this idea is actually hard baked into the logic of Darwinism. When you go to the third chapter of The Origin of Species, Darwin uses an interesting analogy to artificial breeding experiments that ranchers and farmers have been doing from time immemorial, where a farmer or rancher could choose a particular trait that he wanted to see maximized or enhanced. You might think of sheep in the far north of Scotland, and if you want to get a woollier breed of sheep, you would you would select the woolliest males and the woolliest females to breed. And Darwin,
they would.
and then generation after generation, you'd get woollier and woollier sheep. And this is a well-known phenomenon. 19th century biologists knew all about this. Darwin came along and said, well, what if you had a series of very cold winters, such that all but the woolliest died out? Wouldn't you get the same effect? And so he proposed natural selection as an alternative to artificial selection, to intelligently driven selection.
Right.
So the mechanism was meant to exclude a designer in the very way he formulated the theory. Mm-hmm. And so that's been the big issue. Design or no design. Right. Design or apparent design.
Well, I guess what I find so fascinating by this, and one of the reasons I was so happy to get you to come here, is that it's ironic, I would say, at least ironic, that the scientific establishment today is as hidebound in a way, and as I said earlier, calcified in their ideology, that they're not even willing to be slightly open to the possibility that there might be an intelligent force. And so they have been tremendously dismissive, as I understand it, of the intelligent design movement. I mean, you've lived this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I have a friendly debating colleague who is a Darwinist, Michael Ruse, who says that he's written an important book in which he explains that Darwinism has functioned as something of a secular religion for many scientists. And many scientists, I think, have had a difficulty distinguishing what you might call materialistic philosophy from the enterprise of science itself. Mm-hmm. So if you have a theory that has non-materialistic implications, or which challenges a theory that does have decidedly materialistic implications, there's an implied threat to a deeper worldview or metaphysical understanding of reality. And I think all of us respond when our fundamental belief systems are challenged, sometimes with some passion and zeal.
So their objections are irrational and religious.
I wouldn't say they're irrational, but I think that the level of response is, or the passion of the response is understandable from this because of the big issues that are in play.
Are you naturally this kind, or do you just realize that you have to be diplomatic? I have to say, no, that it's the more I have looked at it, I've been staggered by the well, how do I put it? The lack of scientific rigor in that kind of thinking, or maybe just to say the lack of logic.
I can give you a number of it. You know, some of the week my book was released, it was released on this most recent one, June 18th, earlier this summer. By 3 o'clock in the morning, there were about a dozen of these one-star hostile reviews, and some of the turns of phrase were just choice. Mendacious intellectual pornography,
right.
Steaming pile of pseudoscience, that kind of thing. So
that's great.
By people who clearly had read the book very carefully, and
right.
The day after the book was released, there was a 9,400-word review on June 19th. The book is 400 pages plus with notes, and so you can. This is struck a nerve. There were people lying in wait. So,
well, I'd say that's a compliment. I think that the other thing that one hears, and also I have heard it, is that this is not science, and what these people seem to do, and again, you don't have to take a position on what you believe, but the idea that they're so closed-minded that they would simply say it's not science and are unwilling to discuss it, I guess I wonder what they think science is, because if logic and evidence leads you to surmise that, yes, perhaps there was intelligence behind this, that there's design, it's a logical and a scientific conclusion. So to say that you can conclude anything but that is just strange to me. And it seems to me that they have this idea that anything that kicks against, that shakes up this materialist ideology, really religion, is unacceptable. And so they say it's not science, and because most of these folks are part of the powerful scientific establishment, they can say that. So I guess I want to ask you, what is science to you?
Well, this is part of what I studied in my dissertation years in Cambridge. That it turns out that there's a lot of talk about the scientific method, but it turns out there are actually many different scientific methods. And I studied very intentionally, very consciously, the method that Darwin used in reconstructing the ancient past. Discussions of biological origins are, in the end, discussions of natural history. And there's a particular method of scientific reasoning that scientists use when they're trying to study events in the remote past. You can't make a trilobite re-emerge under controlled laboratory conditions. So the kind of science that bench physicists or chemists do in the laboratory is not going to be applicable to studying the ancient past. What Darwin did was pioneer essentially a method of forensic science, where the clues that are left behind are used to reconstruct what happened in the ancient past. And he had an important rule of reasoning, which was that if you're trying to explain an event in the past, you want to invoke causes which are, as his mentor Charles Lyell put it, now in operation. You want to invoke causes that are known to have the power to produce the effect in question. Now, I had become fascinated in the mid-'80s with this problem of the origin of biological information. It turns out that organisms are chock full of digital codes stored in the DNA molecule and other forms of information stored elsewhere. And there is a complex information processing system at work inside organisms that allows them to function and survive. So if you want to build a new cell, if you want to build life in the first place, or if you want to build an animal, you have to have the evolutionary process would have to produce a great deal of information. But that was the very question that was bringing a lot of evolutionary theories to a point of impasse. And so I began to think about this. What is the cause now in operation that produces digital code, that produces information? And I realized there's only one, and that cause is intelligence or mind. In other words, what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, is that intelligence produces information, whether we find it in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of software code. Whenever we find information and trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. And so I realized that by using Darwin's own method of reasoning and his key principle of scientific reasoning, we could make a very rigorous scientific case for intelligent design. So when people say it's not science, I want to say, well why? It's based on scientific evidence, and we're using an established method of scientific reasoning, in fact, the very method that Darwin used. If the theory of intelligent design isn't scientific, by that same logic, then Darwinism would have to be excluded from that same designation.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? It's just, you said you were fascinated by something in the mid-'80s. I remember that. And it's funny, in the mid-'80s, I was fascinated with the Eurythmics. I don't know if you've heard of them. In any case, well, before we get to your book now, I wanted to, actually, to be honest, I was not fascinated by the Eurythmics at all. Before we get to your book, I want to ask you about irreducible complexity. That's another one of these terms that gets thrown around. What you were just saying, essentially, is that the things that exist, these organisms that exist, are too complex, probably too complex, to simply have appeared. And it seems that something with that much complexity, that much information, and when you say information, you mean?
Well, digital code.
Yeah.
Watson and Crick, 1953. They elucidate the structure of the famous double helix, the DNA molecule. 4 years later, Crick proposes something called the sequence hypothesis, which is was the recognition that there are 4 chemicals, they're called bases, that run along the spine of the DNA that function like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. And since then, we've learned that that information is directing the construction of mechanical parts.
So before Watson and Crick, we didn't know any of this, right? And so it was much easier to, what have we done to deserve this? A better? It's going to work? Okay.
Very good.
I'm going to sing. Is it okay? Well, what you're saying, I just want to be sure. In other words, before Watson and Crick, we did not know about the vast, ridiculous amounts of encoded information in DNA. We didn't know about that.
It's typographic or alphabetic or digital. I mean, any of those terms are apt and apply. We have an animation online which shows the DNA molecule. It's the helix structure, but along the interior of that molecule, there are these 4 chemicals. And the chemists actually represent them with the letters A, T, G, and C. And depending upon their arrangement, the molecule is conveying information for building different types of proteins, and proteins are the little machines in cells that do all the key jobs that keep cells alive.
I remember Francis Collins spoke a few years ago when he was talking about this, and just the level of complexity, just to bring it to that, is just absurd. It's beyond our ability to comprehend.